And it was something which occurred on the 1st of July. And it didn't even occur in this country, but it occurred in Winnipeg in Manitoba. And over there, there's a bunch of people who have got a bee in their bonnet about Canadian history. And from an overwrought perspective, I should absolutely add, but who are using a particular matter, which I'll get to in a moment, in order to attack the institutions and symbols of the Canadian state. I'm talking about the fact that a bunch of vandals pulled down a statue of Queen Victoria, who was hugely influential in the creation of Canada, but even worse, pulled down a statue of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Now, of course, the Queen is the head of state of Canada, just as she's head of state of the United Kingdom. We share a very close history with Canada, and we, of course, do share our head of state as well. So an attack on the head of state anywhere in the world where we share the same head of state is an attack also on Britain. So we would expect a very powerful, strong condemnation from the British government of what happened. But of course, we've been noticing in the last 18 months that strong condemnations are never forthcoming from the British government when it relates to things like that. Now, what's the story here? Well, it's part of the whole Black Lives Matter thing that's going round the Western world at the moment. Canada does not have a history of slavery at all. And so the BLM type people can't really work up anything to do with race in Canada, because it's really been quite it's never had any real racial issues to speak of. The only thing it's ever had was when the Europeans, the British and French settlers, came upon the native peoples and wondered how best to integrate them into the Canada that was driving ahead at that time. And during the late 1800s, Canada began to come together as a federation under the Glaswegian John A. Macdonald, because Canada has a huge Scottish diaspora, and in fact, to a large extent, Scots invented Canada. And the first Prime Minister of the Canadian Federation, which came together in 1867, was John A. Macdonald, from a family, and he was born in Glasgow. And he was the Canadian Prime Minister from Confederation, which was 1st of July 1867, until he died in office in 1891, although he had a few years out in the middle there. Now, basically, under his premiership, he came up with the idea to copy the Americans, who had a boarding school system where the Americans would take Native American children and try to integrate them through boarding schools. And he came up with that idea as well for the native peoples in Canada. And these were called residential schools. Now, what people don't understand is the first residential schools were set up probably in 1880 is the best that I can find, but they lasted, until 1996, when the last one was closed down. So they lasted over 100 years. And what has since happened since 1996 is, because of the successful, ultimately, integration of the native peoples in Canada, many of them have become legislators, and many of them become quite influential, and so they have now started to complain about what happened in these residential schools from the position that the white Europeans should not have tried to integrate the native peoples into the white European ways, that this was somehow evidence of a sense of white supremacy or even racism at worst. Well, to be frank, you could argue that the whites believed that their system was superior to what the native peoples were living in at that time. You could certainly argue that. But the point is, when the Europeans and the native peoples came together, what were the options for the white Europeans who had all the power, who had all the drive to build modern Canada? What were the options? Well, one of the options was that the Europeans could have said, forget all this railroad building stuff and all these modern big buildings and stuff. Let's all just integrate into the Native American ways and go and live in the wilds like them. Okay, that's one option. Well, that wasn't going to happen, okay? So we're not going to integrate to the native peoples. The other option, of course, which perhaps some people may even have suggested, was just leave them be, just ignore them, just leave them to their own devices. But again, nobody was going to suggest that practically, because at that time, the native peoples were in a perilous state because their main source of food, buffalo, was essentially going extinct. And so to leave the native peoples be would have been to basically leave them to die. And nobody was going to suggest that practically, and certainly not ethically. That was not an option. So the only option in the Canada was to introduce as best as they could the native peoples into modernity, which they did by the residential schools. Now, during Macdonald has got an awful lot of criticism for this, because from today's perspective, it's easily criticisable. However, what's not noticed or pointed out so much is that it was a voluntary system. There was no compulsion under it. Now, Macdonald died in 1891, and compulsory residential schools for native children did not come in until 1920. And I only discovered this reading this really good article, which we'll put up, called "The Fight Over Canada's Founding Prime Minister. Attacks on symbols of nationhood are not merely symbolic, they strike at the nationhood the symbol represents." This is a really good article by David Frum in The Atlantic, and he points out that at least most of the problems of the residential schools didn't occur until 30 years after Macdonald had passed away, until 30 years after Macdonald wasn't even on this earth. And by all accounts, Macdonald was a fair and very liberal man, and by the standards of his day would be considered very much to be a liberal sort of minded individual, a very good man, and we do want to stand up for him there. So, of course, we hear about the terrible things allegedly that happened in residential schools, but goodness me, you could make up terrible tales about what happened in boarding schools and residential schools throughout the Western world prior to 1970. Everybody's got a horrible tale to tell about what happened to them at residential or boarding schools. I mean, it was a different world, basically, a different world, and a dangerous world as well for a child, because the amount of children dying of disease was massive. I mean, if you were born in the late 1800s, and indeed the first half of the 20th century, your chances of getting out of childhood were often slim, depending upon where you were born into. So there's huge infant mortality and child mortality back in those days anyway. And there was, of course, no welfare state. So when you're looking at how do we best take care of these native children, there was no welfare state to do it. You needed these church schools, these residential schools, which to an extent gave room and board to children who might have suffered badly in other ways. And of course, the native children were not the only children to suffer. I was reading an article in the National, as it happens, about orphans in Scotland, and orphans in Scotland would get shipped out to Canada. And goodness knows what happened to them. Many of them would not survive the passage, let alone the actual time in Canada. And so the Native American and the Native Canadian people are not the only people whose children have suffered, but they were not the only they were not the only children who suffered in the 19th and early 20th century, for goodness sake. And politicians need to stand up and just say that. Look, don't give me your sob story. My ancestors' story is just as bad. I get really irritated by the idea that we've got to, I've got to care. I mean, thousands of Scottish children died in the 1900s and early 20th century. So why have we got to care? We should all care. We should all care, but don't try and make your suffering more important than somebody else's suffering when we live in a world where we've all suffered. So there's that. Anyway, what's happened is that this has grown into a political movement now. And the whites in Canada, who are awfully liberal and kind of soft anyway, they won't say what I've just said, for example. So they just get booted upon, they just get stamped upon, and they just get walked over whenever anybody plays a racial angle like that on them. They just succumb, and they're just so wet, it's ridiculous. So this has now it's now got to the stage where there are people pulling down statues of the head of state of the country. Now, what did Boris Johnson do? And I do have to blame him, and I'm not having a go at him as such, but he is the man that carries the can, so I do have to talk about this. Now, so what was his response? I'll read it in full. He starts off, or a spokesman from Downing Street starts off, "We obviously condemn any defacing of statues of the Queen." Well, that's not a proper condemnation, okay? We obviously condemn is a throwaway condemnation. And then it even gets it wrong, because the statue wasn't defaced. The statue was actually pulled down. But then it goes straight into saying, "We obviously condemn any defacing of statues of the Queen. Our thoughts are with Canada's Indigenous community following these tragic discoveries, and we follow these issues closely and continue to engage with the Government of Canada with Indigenous matters. Our thoughts are with the complaints of those people who are presuming to speak for the Indigenous people." Well, what about your thoughts for us British and Canadians who are upset and angry and troubled that the head of state of our countries has been attacked in this way? What about giving us some thoughts? What about our thoughts for this vandalism which has occurred? Do we have a say in the matter? Do you care about us? Our thoughts are with Canada's Indigenous community. No, how about your thoughts being with the people who support Canada's history, who support Canada's constitution, who support Canada's political structure, who support Canada, who support our head of state, who support our traditions and symbols? How about your thoughts being with us for a change? Or at most, how about your thoughts being for both of us? How about saying that? But no, we're just forgotten about. And here's the thing, when something occurs like a bombing or vandalism, there's three ways of responding. You can respond by an outright condemnation, you can respond with an excuse, or you can respond with a cheer. Those are the three fundamental ways of responding to something. So let's take the 7/7 bombing, for example. The correct way of dealing with that was outright condemnation. We will find the perpetrators and we will punish them, and we will ensure nobody tries anything like that again. Another way of doing it would be, as many people did during the time, I might add, well, that's bad and I don't like people dying in a bus, but It's understandable considering what the Americans are doing in Afghanistan, or what the Israelis are doing in Palestine, or what Britain did during its past, or something like that. That's called an excuse, okay? And all that does is it justifies it in some way. It doesn't actually condemn it. And the third way is to cheer, as I'm sure ISIS did when that happened, and they would say, well, that's what you deserve because of whatever. Okay? So when you're faced with something, you condemn it, or you excuse it, or you cheer it. And the thing is, what's it going to be? So what was that response to the pulling down of Her Majesty outside the Manitoba State Legislature? Was that a condemnation? No, it was not a condemnation. It was an excuse, because they went immediately into trying to justify what happened. They immediately, Downing Street immediately prevaricated, it immediately equivocated, and it immediately went into excuse mode. And so, in other words, it was given the green light for that kind of behaviour just to continue. So, what would a proper condemnation have looked like? Let me tell you. This is what the British government should have said. We utterly condemn the desecration of the historical and current much-loved symbols of Canada, Britain and the Commonwealth, and are appalled at this brazen attack on Canada's head of state. Our thoughts are with those people in Canada, the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth and the world who are shocked to see such behaviour and who are hurt by this attack on a respected and loved historical figure, and on our present highly respected monarch, whom we share with Canada and many other nations throughout the world. We urge the Canadian government to vigorously defend the proud traditions and historical symbols of our shared history and of our shared political culture. We urge a robust response to find and punish the perpetrators of these disgraceful acts. That's what Boris Johnson should have said. Now, can you imagine him ever saying that? Can you imagine any politician in Britain behaving like that? But that's what they should have said, because that's a proper condemnation. Now, as for what may have been the purported reasons for why the people in Canada, in Winnipeg, did whatever they did, well, that is a different matter. And you can deal with that if you want, or you can choose not to deal with that if you want. But it's a different matter. But as soon as you bring it in, to your response, then you do risk excusing the behaviour. You move up a notch from condemnation to excuse to cheering. Okay, so that's how you would properly respond to it, and that's how I certainly respond to it, and that's how a force for good responds to it. Not through equivocation, not through prevarication, but through outright condemnation. And as for the deeper issues, which are political and which are being exploited deliberately, well, you can deal with those at another matter if you so choose to. And you know, those church burnings as well. At least 10 churches have been burned. Now, you won't hear this. What I will recommend is go to rebelnews.com, which is a Canadian media outlet. It's been banned from, naturally, it's been banned from social media and to a large extent. And it's run by a chap called Ezra Levant, who is a really nice chap. I don't know him, I've never spoken to him, but he comes across really well. He's very eloquent. He's a great Canadian patriot who clearly understands the value of the British world, of which Canada is part of. And he represents everything that's best about Canada and indeed the British world. So he's a great chap, Ezra Levant, at rebelnews.com. And every day he and his crew report on the terrible things that are happening in Canada under the wet rag Trudeau's government, if you could even call it a government. It's just a joke, because And Trudeau responding to, and this is another good example, Trudeau responded to the burning down of the Catholic churches by saying, "This is not the way to go." Really? Burning down churches, not the way to go? Okay. Then he said it's unacceptable and must stop. Okay. But then he went straight into saying we must work together to right past wrongs. So straight away he's saying that there are past wrongs that we have to right, and he's linking that with the burning of churches, which all that does is excuse the burning of churches. That's all it does, is excuse it. So he should just simply say burning of churches not acceptable, and for whatever idiotic reasons people have done it, don't even address those in your condemnation. And you may or may not to choose to address them at another time, but you do not address your opponent's reasoning during your own condemnation. You just condemn them out of hand. But so many politicians in the West don't understand the basics of politics. They get to the places they get to be PM, but they have no clue about how to deal with their political opponents. It's astonishing, utterly astonishing.